So what is Adoptium Marketplace? It's the one-stop shop for open source Java runtimes. And you can take a look at the article linked to from this slide. But the main thing for this presentation to understand is that Adoptium Marketplace is a location where members of the Eclipse Adoptium Working Group can list their binaries as long as they meet three criteria. One, they have to be a member of the working group and be contributing back into the project. Two, the binaries that they list in the marketplace must have passed the TCK or the compliance tests. And three, must have passed the AQAvit test suite for quality. And to give a rough sense of what the marketplace will look like, here's a mock-up. And obviously it's not a completed work, but gives you the idea that here will be multiple vendors and their offerings of compliant, high-quality binaries. People who come to the marketplace will be able to choose based on certain things like architecture, package type, or Java version, and be able to locate information and even directly to download files from the vendor's website through this marketplace. And we'll go through, because we want to talk about that third criteria of these binaries being tested with the AQAvit test suite, we'll go through the basic steps. And essentially it's using a particular versioned release of AQAtest. So your vendor, if they're about to go through this and step through it on a command line, they would be git cloning a particular release branch of AQAtests, setting up and configuring their test environment. So pointing to the binary that they want to test against, setting use testinf properties equal to true, and then setting certain other environment variables to point to which Java version and what Java implementation, the JVM implementation they may want. From that, they'll be, that's okay. From that, they will be executing the AQAtest suite, and they'll be running the required test targets, and there are several of them. And after the run, they'll be collecting and publishing a summary of the test results from their run. We'll take a look if they weren't doing this on a command line, which is highly likely, be using some sort of CI/CD system. Here's an example of what they would do in the case of using Jenkins. Again, setting up the job parameters, pointing at the right release branch, setting testinf properties to true, and then executing the set of required test targets. At the end of the run, gathering the summary of the results and publishing that. So what test targets are required? We alluded that there were several. Which ones are they? So for this initial version of AQAvit, the focus will be on 9 targets out of this grid of top-level test targets. And as you look at this grid, you'll see that the columns are groups, the rows are levels, and our expectation for this very first version of AQAvit and what vendors will need to run are looking at the set of functional tests, some system tests, some OpenJDK tests, and some perf tests. And the expectation is that all of these targets must be run and shown to pass. In the case where there's a network blip or a machine configuration issue, vendors are allowed to rerun, fixing the underlying issue, rerun to the point that they can prove that each one of these groups of tests pass, and that they're able to share the TAP file that is produced at the end of the run share that as per the QVSL agreement. Now maybe pass it along to Lan to start talking about some of the details here and what some of the details are for people to share.
Sure. Thanks, Jelly. So in part of the results.zip, we collect a tab file. Tab stands for Test Anything Protocol. It is a file that's generated by our test framework, TKG. In the Jenkins run, our tab file name will match with the Jenkins job. So in this case, you will see the tab file name contains JDK version, JDK implementation, test target, and the platform. So by looking at the name, you can easily identify what this tab file contains. And tab file itself, it's just a text file. On the bottom left, you can see that's a screenshot of the tab file. It basically contains the passing and failed test names and durations. With the failed test, sometimes we'll also collect the console output for the failed test. On the right-hand side is the HTML version of the tab file. I think people are more familiar with this version because that's the one that we often use on Jenkins. So this is the file that we will need in the results.zip file. Also, just to recap, what is in the result.zip, we will be ask vendors to collect all the tab files because we're running nine targets. But depends on what you're running, whether it's serially or in parallel, you may have more than 9 tab files because each child job will generate 1 tab file. In addition to tab files, we'll also ask for metadata file, which is a file that actually gathering Java-version and release information. And all those files should be zipped up and put it in a public server. So let's look into more details about how this AQAvit certification works. How do we ensure all vendors are running the same test material? Our solution is testinf.property file. It checks into Aqua test repo. It captures all test-related repos and branches that are used for AQAvit certification. The testinf.property file will be used if the environment variable use testinf property is set to true. In addition to AQAvit certification, this feature can also be used for bug debugging or iFixes. So let's look a quick demo. So in here, I'm looking at Aqua test repo, and then under testinf, we have a file called testinf.property. This is a master branch, so it's less interesting. We're capturing all test-related repos and their branches because this is master, so it's mostly pointing to a master or dev branch. But in the release branch, in this case, 0.8.0 release, all the related test repos are also pointing to its release branch. So by using this file, we basically git clone those repos and then run the test accordingly. So this is a grinder that I just ran before the presentation. As you can see, user provide adopt repo and branch. For the demonstration purpose, I'm only running OpenJDK, one particular test, JDK math, but in a regular run, we should run that 9 target we just mentioned. And then at the bottom, we choose use testinf property, set that to true. What does this do? It basically, once we set that to true, we load the testinf.property. And then if you really check into the console output, you would see that when we git clone, we'll git clone this particular repo and branch. This is how we ensure all the material are the same. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. So in a regular run, user do not need to check use testinf property variable. And then what happens in that case is the build will run with the default value or user specified parameter, and we will generate the testinf.property, which captures the repos and shards that's used in the build. Here's an example. If you look at the left-hand side, which is the build that I run, on the right-hand side is basically the content of testinf.property file, which captures the repos and the particular shards that I'm using. So far we have talked about how vendors will run tests for AQAvit certification. What happens after the result.zip file is published? How do we do the audit? Well, we're at the first phase of AQAvit certification. So at this point, the result.zip is checked manually. However, we're starting to work on automating the process. Here is the workflow. We will have an API for it. So once vendors are ready to submit the zip file, they will call the API with the URL. And after receiving the API call, TRSS will download the result.zip, pass it, and store the data. The test info will be displayed on TRSS, just like the grid view Shelley showed earlier. TRSS will also generate audit links, like the running Grindr link that we have. The person who verifies it can click on the link and run the build. Once the result is verified, TRSS UI will be updated, and it will notify the vendor with the result. As you can see, our plan is to fully automate the audit process. And this feature can also be used by vendors that do not use Jenkins. They can set up this on their own environment and validate their result. I think that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lan.
No problem.